Me? So welcome all to the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies 2002 Distinguished Alumni Lecture. My name is Erin Corcoran. I'm the Executive Director of the Kroc Institute and also serving as the Acting Director this year, while Asher Kaufman is away on leave. Before we get started, I would like to just take a moment to acknowledge the Kroc Institute's presence on traditional homelands of Native peoples, including the Haudenosaunee, Miami, Peoria, and particularly the Powhatan Potawatomi, who have been using this land for thousands of years and continue to do so. We recognize our own place in the story and practices of colonialism and understand that our responsibilities extend beyond this gesture of land acknowledgement. We also must reflect on the University of Notre Dame's past, present, and future relationship with the original stewards of this land and actively pursue ways to amend this troubled relationship. We also note that a land acknowledgement alone could be meaningless if it were not accompanied by active work to address the structural injustice and violence perpetrated against Indigenous people around the globe, both historically and currently. The Kroc Institute is committed to working to address these harms and find ways to contribute to constructive transformation through our teaching, research, and peace-building efforts. We hope that our celebration today will honor the tradition of these Native peoples as we recognize a guest whose work is committed to the alleviation of poverty and the protection of our environment. At the Kroc Institute, we are constantly aware of that accomplishments and fascinating career paths of our alumni are a chief source of our pride. And I will say personally, as the executive director, one of my favorite things to do is teach our students here and to welcome back our alumni back to campus and see some of the achievements they are doing and contributing back to the work that is in part informed by their education and experiences here at Notre Dame. So since 1987, when the first 4 undergraduate students were awarded a concentration in peace studies, since then, we've graduated over 1,900 alumni. This includes over 1,200 from what is now the undergraduate major or minor in peace studies, over 700 alumni from our master's program, and 38 from our doctoral program in peace studies. After 35 years, as you well can imagine, our alumni are now in active work in over 100 countries around the world. And the Kroc Institute alumni have found a variety of ways to integrate peace studies into their professional work. Some of them identify as professional peace builders, while others have found ways to incorporate the knowledge and values of peace studies in a variety of distinct professions, from religious leadership to teaching, from journalism to parenting. The Kroc Institute's Distinguished Alumni Award honors graduates of Notre Dame's Peace Studies program whose careers and lives exemplify the ideals of peace building across the globe. And just to give you a little bit of a snapshot, in the past, we have honored a Kenyan NGO leader, George Wachira, a development innovator, Molly Kinder, an educator and activist, Kasonia Wise Whitehead of Baltimore, human rights lawyers and advocates, including Chabi Aguirre of the International Criminal Court, Vienna Colucci of Amnesty International, Adriana Quinones of UN Women, and Brittany Nystrom of the ACLU of Arizona or of Utah. In addition, we've also honored Ambassador Onya Popa of Romania, Chinese filmmakers Yu Wanyi, Nigerian journalist Obi Anadike, theater director and writer P. Carl, and most recently scholar and practitioner Bina de Costa. And to this distinguished alumni, we are now privileged to add Valerie Hickey, Global Director for Environment, Natural Resources, and the Blue Economy at the World Bank. Now I would like to invite Ann Hayner, who's our Associate Director of Alumni Relations, to introduce our 2002 Distinguished Alumni Award winner. Thank you all.
We are delighted to welcome Valerie Hickey back to the Kroc Institute, to the Keough School of Global Affairs, and to Notre Dame. Valerie Hickey is an environmental scientist and biodiversity specialist in the World Bank. At its core, her work focuses on marrying puzzles in natural resource management to solutions at the nexus of science and politics. Earlier this year, her success in this challenging work was recognized with her appointment as Global Director for Environment, Natural Resources, and the Blue Economy at the World Bank. Valerie came to the Kroc Institute's master's program in peace studies from Ireland in 1999, after earning a BA in history and political science from Trinity College, Dublin. Following her MA from Kroc, Valerie worked for the World Wildlife Fund, the Wildlife Conservation Society, and the U.S. National Park Service, where she managed invasive species programs in Lake Mead, the reservoir for the Hoover Dam. Valerie joined the World Bank in 2003 as a technical specialist for East Asia and the Pacific, working on biodiversity projects and environmental safeguards in Cambodia, China, and Laos. She soon realized that to be effective, she needed to become bilingual in both peace studies and the natural sciences. After earning a PhD in environmental science and policy from Duke University in 2009, she returned to the World Bank, where she finds it rewarding to work at the system level to influence policies in environmental justice and poverty alleviation. Valerie has since worked across the bank's regions, providing design and implementation support to a variety of operations, including in fragile states such as Haiti, where she led the bank's environment portfolio following the earthquake in 2010. More recently, she's been responsible for providing environmental policy support in Latin America and the Caribbean, overseeing $2 billion of investment across the region, and safeguards on over 400 projects across 23 countries. She managed a cross-sectoral team that supported countries and communities on issues of climate change, sustainable forest management, fisheries, pollution management, and environmental health, economics, and risk management. Ultimately, Valerie's goal is to improve the role of natural resource management in poverty alleviation and help countries invest in projects focusing on environmental health and sustainability, social inclusion, and resilient growth. Through her work, she connects her formative work in peace building with development, climate, and nature in service of those affected by both poverty and conflict. Valerie, I'd like to invite you now up on the stage to join me. We are honored to welcome Valerie back to the Kroc Institute to address the topic, the multiplier effects of the triple environment crises on international peace and development, and to present her with a symbol of our respect. Valerie, the Kroc Institute is proud to recognize your dedication to working for a more just and peaceful world through your work to combine poverty alleviation and environmental protection, and to confer on you the Distinguished Alumni Award of the Kroc Institute. As inscribed on the base of the award, we're confident you will go forth in peace. Congratulations, and welcome back to the Kroc Institute at Notre Dame.
I have to say, you know, as Erin was calling out the names and what people are doing, I'm certainly the least important person you could have chosen for this award, but you have no idea what it means to me, because I wouldn't be anywhere without the Kroc Institute. And I mean that sincerely, not just from the transactional sense that this was the place that got me out of Ireland, but this is the place that gave me an exposure and taught me life lessons that I've never forgotten. Not just in terms of the academic and the intellectual. Notre Dame is an academic powerhouse. We know that the Kroc Institute is a leader in the field of peace studies, but it was more than that. Coming from a small country where we had our problems, we still do, I got to learn about things like grace under fire from one of my cohort, Ben Lacey, who was a member of the US military, who was amidst a cohort of a lot of us peaceniks who thought you couldn't accomplish peace through war. What the hell is this guy doing here? A most amazing man. I learned about the value of real, true friendship and what that means through my cohort, from people like Rima Swiden, who's still one of my closest friends, who just sort of adopted me in the way friends can. and has really shown me the value of friendship, including the value of speaking up and shutting your friend down when they need to be shut down. I learned from Anne how to be patient and persistent, because God knows she had to be, because we put her through the ringer. I was one of the cohort living in Peace House, and Anne was an active negotiator. If anybody deserved a peace prize, it was Anne, because she would come and negotiate what should have been easy battles between peace studies people over things like who ate whose food in the fridge and who had the TV on too late. And these are the sorts of things that really have put the Kroc Institute in Notre Dame in my heart and have allowed me to become a better person. And I've really tried to pay that forward. I haven't succeeded. I'm never going to be as wonderful as Anne. I'm never going to be as smart as Bob. But trying to pull it all together and remember that all of us in our own small way can try and go forth in peace. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about the bigger picture of how the triple environmental crisis, climate change, the loss of biodiversity, and pollution are a threat multiplier that is really making an unstable and unsteady world worse. But I'm not an academic. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time giving you lots of academic theory because I don't know it anymore. So instead, I want to paint a picture of how we in the policy world, at the highest levels of policymaking, and I don't mean me as an individual, but the institution I work with, think about these issues and the kinds of trade-offs and nuance that are our everyday work. So let me start by telling us something that's not new, which is the state of the world is not rosy. I mean, I have to say, when I started in this business, when I came to Kroc in 1999 and left in 2000, it was a period of hope. This was pre-9/11, but post the fall of the Berlin Wall. Decolonialization was more or less fully accomplished. We had gotten rid of the hole in the ozone layer. I mean, we had accomplished things. It looked like the world was going in the right direction. And today we live in a world where a virus that went around the world in a couple of days continues to reverberate 2.5 years later and has changed the world. Where carbon emissions emitted anywhere is leading to sea level rise everywhere. And where a war in Europe is leading to famine in places as far distant as southern Madagascar and Lebanon. So the world is not in a rosy place, but since context is the starting point of every story, I want to throw out a few numbers that are the ones that guide our work every day. Hunger. Today, 222 million people are going to go to bed hungry in 53 countries. And I don't mean hungry because they got home late from work and they missed dinner, they were bold and they were told they were getting no dinner. I mean mothers and fathers who have to listen to their babies cry because they haven't eaten in days. Mothers and fathers who themselves haven't eaten in days because what little food they had, they gave to their kids and their kids still aren't satiated. That's the world we live in today. We live in a world of extreme poverty. Numbers that have gone up, not gone down. For most of my career, we were in a period of global income convergence. Yes, the rich were getting richer, but they're fine. They'll take care of themselves. We don't think about them. But the poor were getting richer too. And that stopped. Today, we've got 719 million people living on less than $2.15 a day. That's the line we use for extreme poverty. And extreme poverty is one of those terms that hides a reality of catastrophic destitution. And that number includes 70 million more people who are hungry, who are poor today, who were not poor before COVID hit. We've never seen that kind of an uptick. Under the SDG agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals, there was a hope that we could end extreme poverty by 2030. That was the commitment. The World Bank, we came out with a report a couple of weeks ago that said by 2030, despite the hundreds of billions of dollars, the trillions of dollars, all of the efforts, 534 million people are still going to be extremely poor. So translate into that, more people hungry. And 60% of that number are going to live in what we call rich countries. So this isn't about some poor countries being poor and everybody else being fine. This is about poor people living everywhere and people getting more and more extremely poor. Access to electricity, something that we all take for granted. In Africa alone, 759 million people don't have access to electricity. And for the first time in history, in terms of trajectory, that's 30 million more people who don't have access. So that's 30 million people across Africa who before COVID had access to electricity. Can you imagine what that would mean in terms of their own ability for kids to study, to do homework, for the health of not straining against some sort of candlelight? And that's 30 million people now who got to that stage and were pulled back down into extreme poverty. Education. 70% of 10-year-olds in the world are now categorized as learning poor, living in learning poverty. What that means is they're basically not literate. They can't read or write. 70% of 10-year-olds. It was 57%, bad enough pre-COVID. It's gotten way worse. And what that means in terms of lost lifetime earnings, $21 trillion. So these are the sorts of numbers. We could talk about refugees and 89 million displaced people and everything. You guys know the numbers. So it's not a rosy picture. And what adds to the sense of doom is that for a long time, the private sector has been heralded as the hero, the white knight who's going to come along and save us all. This happens a lot in the environmental space. We talk about the fact there isn't enough money, but the private sector will come in. We talk about it in education. We talk about it in health. But the truth is, right now, the private sector is pulling out of developing countries, pulling out of poor communities. Because where before the risks might have been higher, the rewards were much higher. And in that simple mathematical equation of risk, reward minus risk, private sector would still invest. Today, the risks are yet higher still. The rewards are no higher than they are in wealthy developing countries because of inflation and interest rate increases. So we're seeing enormous capital flight. So that idea that the private sector can come and save us all sort of gone away. And so that's why, by the way, as a quick aside, at the bank for a long time, our mission has forever been to end poverty. We never thought there was a connection between poverty and peace. We always thought our role in ending poverty was that after a war, you would come in and help the country start again. So it was all about reconstruction. In 2002, for example, we saw a role in Afghanistan as managing the Afghanistan Reconstruction Trust Fund. It's all about going forward, not looking back. And thankfully, we've changed that. In 2011, our flagship report is called the World Development Report. It's where we raise issues that haven't ever been considered relevant in the development space. We raised the issue of peace and conflict and said this is a development issue every bit as much as it's a security issue, every bit as much as it's a diplomatic issue, every bit as much as it's a humanitarian issue. And we've gone so far now that we have a special window that countries who are in a state of fragility, conflict, or violence can access additional money at special price, special terms. And so we recognize the commitment, the connection, between development and peace, something we never had before. And in just about time for a world that is mired in more conflict than it's ever been. 48% of conflict, 48% of poor people live in areas that are in active conflict. That's going to move to 60% by 2030 when we look at where conflict is emerging. So our clients, poor people, are increasingly exactly where there is war and conflict and violence. So given that very rosy picture I painted, but a lot of you are sitting there thinking, then why the hell are we talking about biodiversity? Who could care less? The elephants can take care of themselves. But the truth is, and you guys know this better than I do, environment is a threat multiplier. Whether it's climate change, the loss of biodiversity, or pollution, these crises themselves are a threat multiplier. And we know this from the academic research that's been done in this space. We know that from 1946 to 2010, 40% of intrastate conflict was made worse by or paid for by environmental crime and the loss of biodiversity. We know that the majority of funding, not in all conflicts, but in many, come from environmental crime. So academics have been able to tell us that in a quarter, 25% of global conflicts between 2014 and 2018, so now, in the very recent past, were fights over natural resources. And going forward, academics tell us that for every 1 degree Celsius increase in global temperature, we're going to see domestic violence rise by 2.4% and intergroup conflict by 11.3%. So we have the numbers. Institutions like Notre Dame have showed us and told us this is a threat multiplier. And so what does that mean in terms of how we think about our work? And to be honest, we didn't need academics to tell us because we see this every day. It helps to have the numbers and to have the research and to have the data because we're a data-driven organization. But for everybody who's worked in our space, we know this is already true. Let me give you some examples from each of the 3 crises. Climate change, which is the environmental crisis everybody is most familiar with and sometimes is seen as the only crisis, is often associated with conflict and violence around sudden onset disasters. What happens after 1/3 of Pakistan is flooded overnight a couple of months ago? And what that means for fragility in conflict. What it means after you've had a hurricane or a typhoon and what's left behind. But in fact, what we see is that in climate change, it's the slow onset disasters. It's those creeping disasters. The flooding and the drought that just keeps getting worse year after year that is really leading to conflict and violence. We see this especially in places like the Sahel. So the Sahel 5, so if you take out Senegal, which because it's more heavily urbanized, has different human development indicators. If you look at the other 5 countries, Burkina Faso, Chad, Mali, Mauritania, and Niger. The exception of Mauritania, we're talking about a GDP per capita less than $800. We're talking about 31%, so 1 in 3 people living below the extreme poverty line, including almost 3 million more people who had somehow managed to get out of poverty, get out of extreme poverty, be in a position where they had enough food every day, pulled back into the hellish morass of extreme poverty since COVID. And it's a place where there have been 30 military coups since 1960, where institutions don't function well and they change ownership relatively often and suddenly. You add to that climate change, and this is leading to more serious conflict and more serious loss of faith in government, which, as we all know, is one of those deleterious impacts that really makes conflict so much more intractable. We look at Mali, for example. We recently released a report, it's called a Country Climate and Development Report, that looks at all the stats across the Sahel, really looks at their development ambition, their climate ambition, the climate realities in that country, what it's going to mean as the two conflict, their development ambition and the climate realities. And in Mali, we expect them to start losing 6.5% GDP every year, starting in 2050 because of climate change. Less than that beforehand, but think about that. Imagine if the US could grow 6.5% every year. We would be amazing. You'd have it talked about everywhere. Country like Mali doesn't get to grow that much every year. Right now, their growth is basically zero. So think about what a loss of 6.5% every year would mean. But right now, today, it's even more nasty. So because of climate change, it's not just the aggregate losses that are huge, it's the spatial differentiation. You have two large groups in Mali, one a group of agriculturalists, one a group of pastoralists. Both come from different ethnicities and different identities, and as you can imagine, different cultural traditions. But they both shared the landscape, because the pastoralists grow a type of semi-aquatic grass to feed their cattle called burgoo. And the agriculturalists grow rice, which takes a lot of water, as you know. And for a long time, that was okay. There was enough land, there was enough water, it worked. Mali has lost a quarter of the space of land for the pastoralists. They've been outcompeted by the agriculturalists, because as the total productive land and available water shrinks, the agriculturalists have taken the initiative and taken away the land from the pastoralists. Imagine what that means for a conflict between two different ethnicities, two different groups of people with two different identities, two sets of cultural institutions, fighting over the same small space, with government institutions that should be there to mediate this type of conflict that just don't work. And that's how resources are having a direct and immediate impact on conflict in that space. But of course, it's not just in the climate change space. In biodiversity, I talked a little bit about how it's often biodiversity has been used to finance conflict. One of the examples I always use is the Mozambican Civil War, a horrendously terrible civil war between 1977 and 1992. It was ivory, illegal ivory from slaughtered elephants, that financed that war and prolonged that war for years longer than it would have been if that ivory hadn't been used. So biodiversity and the loss of it is directly driving conflict and financing it. And of course, poaching by itself is bringing in guns and bringing in bad actors to communities who are least able to cope with that. But it's worse than that. In the fisheries space, a combination of biodiversity loss and climate change is creating the right conditions for terrible sexual violence. So there's a whole underground culture, it's not so underground anymore. It's called sex for fish across Africa. So in West Africa, for example, across Africa, about 70 million people are engaged in fisheries. About 20 million people out on boats doing the fishing, and then everybody else doing the drying and the processing and the selling, a lot of those being women. In places like Nigeria and Ghana, we expect, because of overfishing, loss of biodiversity and climate change, we're going to see a loss of 53% of fish stocks in Nigeria, 60% in Ghana. And so here's how people are coping. Is the men go out to fish, and because there's less fish, they come back in, and there's a lot of women who need those fish to dry them and to sell them, because that's their income, that's their livelihood, that's their job. And a portion of those fishermen see this as an opportunity to get away with sexual violence, because they're saying, I'll pick you, but here's my price. So can you imagine the sexual trauma? Can you imagine the violence and the cultural disruption from women being forced to decide at the moment on a pier, either I can get these fish so I can get the income to feed my family tonight, but to do that, here's what I got to do, or I go home empty-handed tonight. So that's what the loss of biodiversity is doing in places in real ways, that's contributing to the worst kind of sexual violence and generational trauma. And then, of course, there's pollution. It's in many ways the least talked about environmental crisis. I've never understood why. COVID, terrible, has killed 6.5 million people since the start of the COVID crisis. That's 6.5 million too many people. But air pollution kills that many people every year. Every year. We close the world for COVID. We don't close a single factory spewing crap for air pollution. What does that mean? It means less a direct contribution to conflict and violence, but more a continuous deadly fraying of the social contract. For people who've managed to get out of poverty and enter the middle class, and it's not easy, but people have done it, they haven't been able to realize the peace and development dividends they thought came with being in the middle class. which included the ability to breathe clean air and have access to clean water when you turned on a faucet. Think about what it must mean for those people after they have given sweat and tears to get out of poverty and into the middle class, to find that a government can't produce clean water. Then what's a government for? That destroys faith in institution. It undermines the social contract that is the foundation of keeping a stable peace in a country. But it's not just that indirect link. Kabwe in Zambia, it's a community of about 200,000 people, about 100 kilometers north of Lusaka, the capital. It is the most polluted place on the planet. And this was a place that throughout the 20th century, the economic sector was mining. It's a huge amount of lead mining. The US says that a maximum, a ceiling, parts per million of lead in the environment should be around, let me make sure I get this right, around 400. In Kabwe, it's around 10,000. In the US, no lead in the blood is safe, but 5 micrograms per deciliter of blood is considered the absolute maximum. Beyond that, you need chelation therapy in order to help bind the lead to get it out through your system. We've been engaged in Kabwe. We've been doing health testing of kids. There's no kid who has less than 45 micrograms per decibel. There are lots of kids with over 150. And so, yes, we're going in and we're helping build the health system and we're doing the chelation that's necessary to try and remove the lead, but the impacts from lead poisoning are largely irreversible. The developmental degradation and deficits are permanent. And I'm sure you've all read the studies, we all do, that lead poisoning can make people more swift to anger. It can make them more violent. Not their fault. It's because of cerebral deficits. That means some parts of their brain that make that fight or flight lead you towards more fighting than fleeing. So we have an entire community of people, an entire generations now, who have no hope for peace. So what do we do there? So those are the sorts of examples and the places. And that's why we spend a lot of time thinking through, so how do we solve these? What does it mean to disarm environment as a threat and a multiplier for peace and for ending poverty? And we've struggled. And we continue to struggle because it's not so straightforward. And let me walk you through an example that of all the types of conflict should be easy, right? In some ways, it's a silly example, and I want to use it to show you just how difficult this is. And it's the example of international negotiations over climate change, and how even trying to deconflict those and disarm environment as a threat multiplier is very difficult. And here's why. So there's 3 key questions that are always asked and around which the climate negotiations always revolve. And starting next week in Egypt, they'll revolve around these 3 issues. The first is, who gets access to climate finance? What does the climate finance get spent on? And by climate finance, they mean international climate finance, the famous 100 billion that the global north was to give to the global south for climate change. And the truth is, it gets spent on both adaptation and mitigation. Mostly mitigation. So in 2020, there was $632 billion spent on climate finance. Now, that's a lot less than the 4 trillion that was needed. So there's never enough money, and we have to take that into account. But of that 632 billion, which is a lot of money, 93% of it was spent on mitigation. And at first glance, that's a good idea. If we don't bend that curve of emissions and flatten it to 0, we are just making the impacts of climate change worse, and we are just adding another generation who's going to suffer through them. But at the same time, if we're spending 93% of climate finance on mitigation, we're sacrificing current generations who don't have the coping strategies to deal with climate change today for the interests of future generations. That's not climate justice either. It also means we're putting money in the places that have the highest emissions, which means a huge amount of climate finance goes to East Asia, not to places like Africa, not to small island developing states, both of which are really on the front lines of the impacts from climate change. Is that climate justice? I don't know, but those are where the debates get really heated and where you end up having some of the worst conflict that's, again, leading to a fraying of multilateralism and leading to a fraying, even when we all share a common problem, to people fighting for very different solutions. The second question that always gets raised, forgive me, is who pays for that money? That 100 billion, it's the global north, right? That's an easy answer. Everybody should be content. That shouldn't make the sort of fraying of multilateralism worse. And not so fast. I mean, I'm sure many of you have seen the discussions even within the US. Because yes, climate emissions increased 14 times since 1950. But it wasn't all by the global north. So are we going to ask the global north to pay for the global south? Maybe. But who is the global north? 11% of Americans, as 39 million people, live below the poverty line in this country. Are we going to visit the sins of their fathers, and probably not even their fathers, but the guys who run their local government's fathers or their local businesses' fathers, on them, and ask them to pay for something from which they didn't necessarily benefit, and today they don't? Are we going to ask the families in Flint, Michigan, who can't get clean water out of their pipes, to pay for climate emissions in China? It's not such an easy answer. What about the role of China? So today, China emits 30% of global emissions. The US emits for about 14%. So China emits more than twice as much as the US does. Germany emits less than 3%. So we're going to ask Europe and the US to pay the bill. And China wants part of the money that comes from that bill. Maybe, maybe not. Is that climate justice? How do you explain that here in the US or Europe as you go into a recession, as governments are having to make decisions about money for healthcare and education? So again, not so easy. What's the role of Africa? So yes, today Africa emits less than 4% of global emissions, the entirety of sub-Saharan Africa. If you take out South Africa, it's less than 2.5%. Africa is in no way responsible for global emissions. But Africa's population is booming. Population of 1.3 billion today is going to be 3 billion by 2060. And even if by then, Africans only double their per capita emissions, so they only emit in 2060 what India emits today, about 2 tons per person. And that's compared to, for example, in the US, 16 tons per person. Sub-Saharan Africa will emit as much carbon in 2060 as the US does today. So are we suggesting that we're going to charge them in the future? They're going to have to foot the bill for climate adaptation? Yikes. So as you can imagine, these are some of the real conflicts. And why, even in a space where you would think the answers are obvious so we can deconflict the space, they're not at all so obvious. And the third question, similarly, who gets to emit? And most everyone will agree it should be Africa. They need to grow, they need to develop it. That means using fossil fuels for a period, okay. But again, by 2060, you add all that together, it's meaningful. China, which is emitting, as I said, 30% of global emissions today, is refusing to commit to net zero before 2060. India before 2070, another country that has large and growing emissions. So this idea of a global north and a global south and all the money should flow in one direction, not so easy. So these are the sorts of debates we have. And this is why even in a space where we all sit around a nice room in suits, we're all ourselves, the people sitting around suits, generally not in danger because we all come from the middle class. Even without that personal risk of climate change affecting us and our families, we're still locked in battle. We're still fraying multilateralism because the answer to these questions are not so easy. But I don't want to sort of finish without providing a little bit of hope. It can be hard, right? Particularly these days. But the thing that gives me hope is that we've been here and worse, and we've gotten out of it. I think the challenge is for my generation is that we don't have a physical memory of really bad times. World War II was 25 years before we were born. So we've seen development go in one direction for most of our lifetimes, and it did go in one direction. In my lifetime, until COVID, global poverty was cut in half from over 2 billion people to less than 800 billion people. Think about that. That's 1.2 billion people who got out of poverty in my lifetime. More or less everybody, except in places at war, suddenly had access to education, including girls in my lifetime. The education may not have been great, but at least we had cracked the access to education part. Maternal mortality was reduced by half, so was child mortality. It means there's 100 million kids who are now growing into young adults who wouldn't be around today if that hadn't changed. So we have, as a world, been able to come out of conflict, being able to build consensus, be able to build resilient societies. And as we at the bank look to think, how did we do that? What are the keys? We think about a world where we have to stop talking about either or solutions. Because in the environment space, we end up having a conversation around either or. And instead, we have to talk about both and. We have to expand the space we're discussing. For example, in climate change, we can't talk about adaptation or mitigation. We need both. And so the conversation has to be about, where do we do each one? And that becomes very important. In biodiversity, where I'm very worried that the conversations for the upcoming Conference of the Parties that will take place for the Convention on Biological Diversity in Montreal this December, at which they want to have a Paris moment for biodiversity and have a global biodiversity framework. It's been reduced to a discussion that's labeled 30 by 30. How do we protect 30% of the land and sea by 2030? So it's an either or discussion. It's let's focus on the 30. We keep saying, no, he's sure the 30% matters, but so does the other 70%. So does that agricultural landscape and those urban cityscapes and their biodiversity, because biodiversity is not just natural capital, it's economic capital. So we can't just focus on the 30%, we have to focus on the 70%. In pollution, we can't have a conversation that's either we grow now and clean up later, or we don't grow, but we keep things clean. That's a false choice. Nor do we want to have a conversation around prevent pollution or clean up polluted areas. We need both. And that's why we're spending time investing in the cabways of the world that need wholesale regeneration. But we're also working in South Africa, where they're decommissioning a big coal-fired power plant, to make sure that as they decommission it, as they knock down all of the large infrastructure that supports a coal-fired power plant, they not only manage the waste properly, so it doesn't affect people's health, but they manage the environment and they manage the entire landscape so that there's regional development built on the other natural resources in that area. So it's both and. It's also both and when it comes to something that is often debated in policy circles, which is, do you take a top-down or a bottom-up policy approach? And the truth is, it has to be both. And at the bank, we've been guilty of doing too much top-down. So we're getting to the bottom-up party a little bit late, but we've arrived. And it's important because we need rules of the game that are set, that are predictable. There's a predictability premium that attracts private capital, that gives people the confidence to invest, gives families and households the confidence to invest in their land and their household and education when they know the rules of the game are set. So top-down policy making does matter. But if you only do top-down policy making, then you often end up proposing solutions that don't work. And even if they work from a technical perspective, they're not going to work in that community. They're not going to be owned. They're not going to be managed, and they're not going to last. And so you need both that top-down and bottom-up to rebuild the social contract that we know as it frays ends up tearing at stability, tearing at peace, and leading to conflict eruption. We also know that when it comes to money, something we spend all of our time at the bank thinking about, it's not about grants or loans. It's not about investment financing or results-based financing. It's about both and all of them. It's not about international finance or private capital. It's about both. It's not about a carbon tax or subsidy reform, which I've never understood, because governments in poor countries who have so little money to begin with are paying people to emit more carbon through fuel subsidies. At the same time, they're taxing them for all the carbon they do emit through carbon taxes and carbon pricing. It doesn't make any sense. So it's both and again, and this is the space that we're really pushing. And finally, it's not about environment or development or environment or peace. It really is about both. Because as environment is a threat multiplier, it's usually in places where people are fighting over too many or too few resources. It's in places where people feel the humiliation and the shame of having other peoples come from outside to their lands and take for profit their resources, leaving behind nothing but degraded land and disease. Those are the places where environment most compounds and even creates conflict. And those are the places where when you nurture the environment and you grow it, and you protect it and you sustainably use it, you recognize that natural resources, natural capital, and clean environment is the wealth of poor communities. It's the wealth of poor countries. And that if you think about it as an engine of growth and an engine of meeting middle-class aspirations and an engine of rebuilding the social contract, it's no longer a choice between environment or peace or environment and development. It's about doing green, resilient, and inclusive development where it's a win-win for both. Thank you.
So just a little bit about format. We're going to open it up for Q&A, both for people in the auditorium in person, and we also have people online. So Lisa Gallagher over here has the mic, and if you are interested in asking a question here live, please raise your hand. She's also coordinating with Jenna O'Brien, who's handling the online questions. And if you're just able to stay up here, Valerie, and answer a few questions, that would be great. Thank you for such a really compelling talk. We really love. Thank you.
So much. Announce myself. Okay. Hi, my name is Ernesto Verdeja. I'm on the faculty here. Thank you so much for this really fantastic and sobering presentation. One of the things that you focused on a lot in the discussion of the challenges was the fraying of multilateralism. So that's a really important question or important issue. And then in addition to that, you noted essentially you use the language of we a lot, but really all the multiple numbers of collective action problems that occur. And I guess my question is really more of a statement, and I'd be curious to hear your reflections on it. When I read this kind of stuff on this topic, I find it enormously depressing. I don't see anything positive in the future. I'll be just quiet. And I'm a peace professor also. I'm on the faculty, like I said. But there's something of a ticking time bomb, right? I mean, there are these tipping points that can be hit, and then it exacerbates, and there's this cascading effect. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about what you see the realistic possibilities for some acceptable form of response to the present condition in which we as people on the planet find ourselves. I don't see things looking better in 20 or 40 years. Again, I'm not an expert, so I'd be curious to hear what you have to say, because the final set of comments, many of them were either meso or micro level responses, it sounded like. Thank you.
If you're not an expert, Ernesto, it frightens me that you would think I would have any idea how to answer that. what's interesting in the moment is we've come through a period the last few years where choices have been very muddled. Because for a long time, we seemed to be on a path. It was a slow path, but it was a positive path. That arc of history was bending towards justice and development. And the last couple of years, we've all been muddled as to where that path is leading. And I think we've entered a moment where there are now more definitive choices for what those paths look like. So, for example, this is the first time in my 20 years at the bank, we have what are called annual meetings. Every year, we have our board of governors, which are central bank governors or ministries of finance or heads of state, come together and talk to us about what we're doing. We have big conversations together with our sister institution, the IMF. This is the first time in 20 years where I've heard the term multilateralism discussed in every meeting. And this sense, and it's a gift, and it's a terrible thing in some ways to say that the war in Ukraine has done, is it has clarified the choices for the trajectories out of this. And it's done it in a way that has polarized the world, but at least gotten us out of that muddle. And so we're talking about multilateralism because what used to be the old sort of Western alliance has reforged. And for a long time, we let it fray. And, you know, we would have the most idiotic competition where it would be, you know, whose flag gets attached to what project. We don't want to join your project because you started it. We're going to start our own project so we get bigger billers, headlines, silly things. And that frayed and tore up multilateralism. And I think it was part of why multilateralism started to die. And this has reforged it. What's happened in the last 8 months in Ukraine, I think, has reforged multilateralism. And it's also provided other countries with other development models, the Indias and the Chinas, who have a different development model, who have been successful at the aggregate level with the grow now, clean up later model. And I say at the aggregate level because always aggregate numbers hide a huge amount of individual hardship. And we can forget that. So I think in some ways, this new polarization is presenting stark choices. And if we think about the Cold War and we think about what happened coming out of the Second World War, it was that same sense of choice that in some ways helped people get back together again and figure out where now there is a stark choice, not just a muddle, where we're not sure what the choices are. That's what gives sort of me hope in an abstract sense, but honestly, in a very practical sense, the war in Ukraine is horrendous. But we're also finally seeing the emergence of leadership that is much stronger than we've seen in a while, and people resisting, and people standing up for what's right and for good, even though they have to sacrifice. You know, look at what's happening in Iran. Who would have thought 5 years ago, 5 months ago, that women would be walking the streets, taking off their headscarves, knowing that they risked being beaten, being killed, like Mahsa Amini. So there are points of light. And I think there are people who now see the different trajectories and have to make choices. And in making choices, I think it forces people to ally to deploy their resources behind those choices. So for me, that's the only hope I see. And I do sometimes feel hopeless, but I do know we've done this before. I can't imagine what it would have felt like in 1944 or early 45 when the world had collapsed, when same thing, you had 60 million displaced people in Europe alone, you had infrastructure gone, you had no sense of, you know, you had countries all over the place collapsing, and we got out of it. We found a way to use that and the choices that came out of it. It wasn't easy. So, I mean, that's a very rambling answer, but I do think institutions like the World Bank, even though it's self-serving to say it, I think become more important at these times, in part because we are co-owned by everybody. We are a cooperative, and we're a space where we have the money, $113 billion last year, where we can actually affect change. And as countries come together and as they want to see change happening, they get to negotiate it in boardrooms like the World Bank that are relatively safe spaces rather than through proxy wars. And they get to deploy resources following those discussions that can actually impact change. So I am hopeful. I do hope we can bend the curve of emissions without sacrificing people who are suffering today in climate change. I do hope that we can come up with new ideas for plastic pollution, for example, so that today where single-use plastics are, the alternatives are unaffordable or unavailable in so many places, that won't be the case in a few years, because we're going to have really smart brains working on figuring those out. I'm hopeful that we're still going to have biodiversity flourishing, not just so we can go visit it and enjoy David Attenborough specials, but so that people who live in those areas and the indigenous peoples and local communities who have stewarded these species and these landscapes for generation and for centuries will finally be rewarded for doing it. And we'll see that that natural capital gives them a pathway out of poverty. It's not just a path to a nice vacation for already rich people.
Thank you for the very informative talk. So my name is Rahman and I'm from Kyrgyzstan. I'm a MGA student concentrating on sustainable development. In your talk, you juxtaposed several negative impacts of COVID-19 on poverty, electricity, and so on. I was wondering, like, is there any positive impact, like, due to lockdown, several companies were cancelled, flights were cancelled, and then we emitted less carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. So do you think, is there a major reduction in greenhouses in that case, given that fact? Thank you.
So we did actually see, when it came to emissions, they did go down in 2020. It was a blip because people stopped driving, people stopped flying. They didn't go down as much as we'd expected. And in fact, in some ways, it's causing more trouble now because everybody's talking about the rebound. And it looks worse than it would have been if 2020 hadn't been a dip. But what's interesting, what COVID has helped us do is really concentrate on pollution a little bit more. One of the reasons that UNEA, the United Nations Environmental Assembly, agreed to start the process to have a new internationally legally binding instrument to combat plastic pollution was because COVID introduced so much single-use plastics into the environment that in one moment in time, people were confronted with, oh, good golly, where is all of this going to go? When people take off their mask every day and get a new one, where does that mask go? And it brought back the conversation around solid waste management, which is another conversation that we don't have enough. And it's part of middle-class aspirations, that you can have stuff, that you can dispose of it, and someone will take care of it and dispose it, and you're not going to be seeing it on the ground. Everything isn't going to be littered and destroyed. So COVID focused the mind a little bit on plastic pollution, I think was part of the reason we have the conversation starting later this month in Uruguay on the first session to begin writing that new treaty. It also focused the mind on zoonotic disease and the connection to the loss of biodiversity. We're seeing in a lot of places that the arc of deforestation is where we're seeing new diseases emerge. And COVID was one of those focusing the mind moments where this wasn't a zoonotic disease that, oh yeah, DRC has had another Ebola outbreak. DRC is far away, nobody goes there. But this is suddenly a zoonotic disease with the ability to travel rapidly around the world. And so that has led to thinking about healthcare surveillance linked to the loss of biodiversity, linked to deforestation and land degradation, linked to poaching. And that is huge. That we've never been able to convince the health community before that any of this mattered. And suddenly they see, both them and the agriculture community, that if they're not helping us monitor those arcs of deforestation, where poaching is happening, so people are coming into the presence of wildlife, they're going to miss the next COVID. And so there have been bright spots, there have been silver linings. I wish we didn't have to have COVID to get here, but we always have to take what we can get. And we've been turning this crisis into an opportunity in those spaces where we can. Thank you, Rachel.
We have time for about one more question. If someone has a question they'd like to ask.
Thanks. My name is Caroline Hughes. I'm a professor at the Kroc Institute. Thank you so much for your talk. It was really fascinating. I guess my question is, one of the things we saw during COVID, and you've mentioned a number of examples of this in your talk, is exactly this kind of failure of collective action or failure. And you mentioned, the refusal of different groups to make sacrifices for the sort of general good, and that's really what we're looking for to tackle some of these problems. And I guess I wanted to ask you. One of the things that strikes me as being particularly difficult when you're sort of thinking in terms of, how do I, as an individual, respond to this, or how do I know, what to support? How do I how do I kind of, change my own carbon footprint and all that sort of thing, is that it's very difficult to know because we've fed a lot of misinformation about what's going on. There was a report, I think a couple of weeks ago, that 5% of American plastic is recycled, and we've all been diligently recycling for years. It turns out that it was just being thrown in the sea effectively. Similarly, I think, part of the problem with climate financing is that for many years, there's been a sort of predisposition, I suppose, or there's been a consensus against heavy taxation. Tax is almost sort of a bad word, and that has kind of, so the inability to sort of regulate countries that are greenwashing and not actually contributing, the inability to, properly tax, corporations, rich people, the inability to prevent money from flowing offshore. It seems like, there's a kind of a crisis of regulatory capacity that makes that collective action, much less possible. And I'd have to say, I think the World Bank has been kind of part of that. The World Bank has been anti-tax. It's been, sort of bonfire of regulations kind of language for many years. Is there a change in the World Bank's thinking on this? Is the World Bank thinking, we need to have some tough regulation here. We need to rein in some of these things. We need to change our attitude towards private corporations, and we need to sort of bring them into line. Is that sort of thinking happening, or what is the thinking about the need to better regulate? Thanks.
So thank you, Caroline. I think I'd love to send you to some capitals where they're always complaining we're pushing them to do more taxes, and to hear that there's a sense that there isn't. In fact, we've been pushing a carbon tax on a lot of countries, but being very careful to make sure it's progressive. Because the concern often with things like carbon taxes is that it's easiest to do in a way that can be highly regressive. That's why we also talk about subsidy repurposing, not subsidy elimination, which, if you think about it, is sort of the mirror image of taxation. Because what we find is often in the past, we've been pushing to remove or eliminate fossil fuel subsidies, as an example. Fossil fuel subsidies are often terribly targeted, so everybody gets one. If you remove them, the only people who hurt are the poorest people. The greatest example of this for me is Chile. So Chile was to host the climate COP in, I think it was, 2019, right before COVID. And we were all getting ready. We were all excited to go to Chile for a wonderful party. And as part of their climate leadership, Chile decided that in Santiago, their capital city, they have a sort of a metro system, for lack of a better word. They were going to change the energy matrix for that metro system to renewable energy, to signal that this is important. We're going to start to green public transport. Public transport's already better than individual transport. We're going to green it further. But to change the energy grid, it was going to cost 1 or 2 more cents per ticket, because it was going to be more expensive. Well, we all know what happened. That fell on the poor. It fell on the working poor, who for them, a 1 or 2 cents was the difference between you're able to create a little bit of savings or have that rainy day savings at home and not. The government collapsed. We all ended up having to go to Spain for our climate COP that year. And so this is the danger we have when you have top-down planning that seems okay in the moment. And when you think we're going to enforce through regulation some sacrifice without thinking who that sacrifice falls on and who has the best coping strategy to actually deal with it. And that's why this combination of top-down and bottom-up, doing locally led climate action, engaging in proper stakeholder engagement. I remember in Madrid spending hours and hours with the Minister of Environment from Chile, plotting out an entire way to think about stakeholder engagement, because that's where they failed. They didn't realize the working poor didn't have that space in their budgets. So that's where we have that both and agenda, and carbon taxes are an important part of it, but it has to go with subsidy repurposing. And it has to be taxes that are progressive and that don't just hit the poor. Because too often the climate change discussion ends up being a discussion around sacrifice. And sacrifice is kind of a meaningless term for people for whom making a change is easy and your lifestyle isn't really affected. There may be a transactional sacrifice in the long term, but if you're going to move from, a gas guzzling car to a Tesla, that'll be okay. The problem is often that sacrifice goes down the income spectrum and it becomes really what a sacrifice is. And people have to do more and people have to give something up in real terms. And that's why I don't like the term sacrifice. I don't like the discussion around climate change is around sacrifice, because it shouldn't have to be. We're talking about greening economies so that they can grow more and even grow faster, just do it in a cleaner way. We're talking about greening economies because those will be more inclusive economies, because you won't have what you have today, which is economies that may have grown fast, but they only grew fast in the aggregate. They grew in some places, most people were left behind. So I think we need to stop talking about sacrifice, talk more about things like carbon taxes. One of the big discussions we have at the bank is around carbon pricing and what's the proper price for carbon. Because while we're pushing carbon taxes, we're also pushing the carbon market. But the current price for carbon is around $5 a ton. It doesn't cover the production of that emission reduction or the reduction of those emissions. So pricing matters. So we are a different institution than we were a generation ago. We're an institution that still makes mistakes, but that really does think through when it comes to this triple environmental crisis, how do we turn it into an opportunity for those communities and those countries that have been left out of the old growth paradigm, that have suffered from the old growth paradigm? And how do we make sure those regulatory tools that create that predictability premium put in place rules of the game that privilege the poor? And that if anybody has to give something up, it needs to be people at the top end of the spectrum. So we're doing better, Caroline. We can still do better yet, and we will. So keep the pressure on us.